Explain the steering gears in brief. We know that in the steering system, the steering wheel rotates, which rotates the steering column. This causes the drop arm to swing, which provides a near linear movement to the drag link. Here we can see that the rotational motion of the steering wheel gets converted to linear motion of the drag link. This is done with the help of a steering gear. The function of this steering gear is to convert the rotary motion of the steering wheel into the linear motion of the drag link. Now let's discuss the construction and working of steering gear in detail. On the basis of design, steering gears are mainly of 5 types. Worm and worm wheel steering gear, worm and nut steering gear, worm and roller steering gear, recirculating ball type steering gear, and rack and pinion steering gear. Now let's discuss each one by one. Worm and worm wheel steering gear. A typical worm and worm wheel steering gear can be shown as: it consists of a steering column which is provided with square threads or worms on its end. This worm is engaged with a worm wheel provided in the casing. The drop arm or pitman arm is attached rigidly to the wheel spindle that carries the worm wheel. Now as the steering wheel rotates, the worm rotates. This causes the worm wheel to rotate with it, and thus move the drop arm end almost linearly, thus providing the steering. Generally, the arc of movement of drop arm is around 60 degrees. Because of this, some manufacturers use only a sector instead of complete worm wheel to make it a smaller and lighter mechanism. But the complete worm wheel has an advantage over the sector worm wheel, which is that, in the case of complete worm wheel, the backlash due to veering out of the teeth of the worm and worm wheel can be easily adjusted. For this, the worm wheel is mounted over an eccentric bush. Now when the worm and wheel are worn out and separated, the bush is rotated by some angle which brings the worm and wheel together again and makes up for the wear. Worm and nut steering gear. A typical worm and nut steering gear can be shown as: here steering column is provided with the worm at its end. This worm is in mesh with a nut arrangement. This nut is attached to the cross shaft, which also has the drop arm rigidly attached to it. Now when the steering wheel rotates, the worm rotates with it. This causes the nut to move up or down along the axis of the column. This linear movement of the nut causes the cross shaft to rotate in an arc, which as a result causes the drop arm to move in an arc, thus providing the steering. Worm and roller steering gear. A typical worm and roller steering gear can be shown as: here the steering column is provided with the worm at its end. The diameter of the worm is more at its ends and gradually reduces towards the center. A roller is kept in mesh with this worm. The roller has a cross shaft which is fitted to the drop arm. Now when the steering wheel rotates, the worm rotates with it. This causes the roller to rotate as well as move up and down in an arc. As a result, the drop arm also moves in an arc, thus providing the steering. Recirculating ball-type steering gear. A typical recirculating ball-type steering gear can be shown as: here the steering column is provided with the worm at its end. A ball nut rack is mounted on the worm, and 2 sets of balls are provided in the groove of the worm, in between the nut and the worm. These balls help in reducing friction during the movement of the nut rack on the worm. To recirculate these balls while steering, 2 mechanical guides are also provided in the nut rack. The nut rack is also provided with a few teeth outside, which always remain in mesh with the worm wheel sector. The drop arm is attached rigidly to the wheel spindle that carries the worm wheel. Now when the steering wheel rotates, the balls in the worm roll in the grooves and cause the nut rack to travel along the axis of the worm. This movement of the nut rack causes the wheel sector to turn at an angle, which causes the drop arm to move in an arc and thus provide the steering. Rack and pinion steering gear. A typical rack and pinion steering gear can be shown as: here the steering column is extended and attached to a pinion at its end with the help of a universal joint. This pinion is meshed with the rack, which has ball joints on both its ends to allow for the rise and fall of the wheels. Now when the steering wheel rotates, the pinion rotates with it. This causes the rack to move linearly, which causes the tie rods and stub axle to move, thus providing the steering. This type of steering is mainly suitable for small cars where steering forces are light. However, the gear ratio is limited by the diameter of the steering wheel and the pinion gear. On large vehicles with heavier loads, this becomes a disadvantage. That's why on large vehicles, recirculating ball-type steering gear is used. Now let's summarize the steering gears as